Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Meltdown, scandal, sleaze, and the collapse of Credit Suisse. For centuries, Swiss banks have served the globe's wealthiest individuals, employing a strict culture of anonymity and gaining massive wealth within the process. But when Credit Suisse collapsed, the veil of secrecy came down and the world was suddenly privy to the corruption scandal and empty hubris that keeps the biggest banks alive. It is the subject of a great new book by a respected financial journalist, Duncan Mavin. I'm delighted to say that Duncan joins me live on the line now. Duncan, good morning to you.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Swiss banks, we tend to think of them as being solid, rock solid, unflinching, slightly mysterious, but all in all, a force of sort of unflappable good. This book absolutely takes a hard look at it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, their branding over the years has been amazing. They sort of position themselves as these sort of bastions of respectability in many ways. But once you scratch beneath the surface, you find all sorts of problems at Credit Suisse in particular. You know, one of the things I think to think about is what they've really thrived on over the years has been a Swiss law that said banks had to be private and keep their information about their customers secret. And, you know, that's great if you want to put your money there and you don't want people to find it. And then you have to think which sort of people want to put their money in a place where nobody could ever find it and who they are is kept secret. I think that's a kind of critical piece of what the bank really represents. And yeah, when it collapsed, a year and a half ago, it suddenly is revealed to be what is really there, which is a bank that had sort of lurched from one scandal to another for literally decades, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you think about the sort of person who wants to put their money in there, and as well as those who want to hide their wealth for, say, tax evasion rather than tax avoidance, etc. But you do get. It's obviously going to be open to criminal money laundering or whatever, and also because of the geographically. And I know we're going back some 80 years now, but it's one of my sort of special subjects. You know, with money and booty and whatever taken by the Nazis during the collapse of the Reich.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I don't want to sort of be too down on all Swiss banks. Clearly, they kind of perform a function that's pretty good for some people. But you're right to point to the stuff with the Nazis, which I think became a bit of a sort of cliche, something we sort of dash off as like, oh, Swiss banks and the Nazi gold, as though it's sort of, we don't think about it too deeply. But actually, once you start to look at Credit Suisse, this is a real thing. They really did, and they were covering it up. As recently as the 1990s in a sort of large way, and still, within the last few years, they've still been covering up what they did with the Nazi gold. I think there's sort of two elements to that story, actually, which I found really staggering once I did the research. One was not only were they kind of laundering Nazi money in an era when no other banks in Europe would really touch it, but they were also taking money from Jewish victims of the Holocaust who were sort of seeing the Nazis coming and saying, I need to put my money in a place where nobody can find it. I'm going to put some in Switzerland. Then when those people came after the war and said, can I get my money back? The Swiss banks, and Credit Suisse in particular, was saying, well, do you have any proof? Where's your ID? And in some cases, people were turning up with account numbers, passports, and because they didn't have a death certificate from their father who died in Auschwitz, the Swiss bank wouldn't give them the money back. This is happening in the 1990s. In the meantime, the bank's just charging fees against these accounts, draining the money out of it. It's really, really morally reprehensible behavior, and it's sort of not history, right? It's current affairs.
And I know we're not going to be down on all Swiss banks, but it does sort of, if you have a culture that is secretive and non-accountable, then Duncan, that surely is going to lead to a culture that is, or a bank or an organization that thinks that the normal rules of finance, of banking, of morality even, don't apply to it.
I think that's a very fair comment. I mean, look, I think the particular problem at Credit Suisse, or a particular thing that happens at Credit Suisse, is that they not only have that issue to deal with, the kind of Swiss privacy and that has positives and it has a lot of negatives. They deal with autocrats, and they deal with oligarchs, and they deal with money launderers, and at one point they get criminally convicted because they're laundering money for Bulgarian cocaine smugglers. So not only do they have that side, but in the case of Credit Suisse, they also have a really hard-charging American investment bank attached to them. And that bank is also up to all of the things that we think of when things go wrong in the city and on Wall Street. And so you get these two pieces of the bank that are both getting into trouble. One from one year to the next, one might be the one that's doing worse, but it's almost relentless.
The thing is, though, I mean, if you were to name sort of Swiss banks, UBS, perhaps, Credit Suisse, I mean, this is a big brand. It's not some sort of shady sort of, quiet little Swiss bank. This is a major player. This represents Switzerland on the world stage. Everybody knows the logo. Everybody knows the name.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And the reason for writing the book for me is this is a 170-year-old bank. It's got tens of thousands of employees. It's managing trillions of dollars. It's a major player. It's one of only a handful of banks that are sort of marked by regulators as systemically important, meaning that if they go down, potentially they bring the whole system down. And yet it collapsed. And so I was trying to figure out, how did this bank collapse? I think it is particularly bad for brand Switzerland. I think there's been a lot of kind of hand-wringing in Switzerland after the collapse of Credit Suisse. One of the things that I was sort of not aware of, but feel like I'm more aware of now, and I'm certainly no expert on Swiss culture, but one of the things that I sort of learned a little bit about was that banking is really a thing in Zurich. And in Zurich, it is the industry. But the rest of Switzerland doesn't feel the same way. And so when these banks kind of get involved in scandals, when Credit Suisse has these scandals on an international level, and we can talk about some of them, and they're astounding, it's an embarrassment to the rest of the country. And so when it collapsed, there is a lot of sort of political questions and a lot of people questioning, do we really want to be a country that is, so well known for having these secretive banks?
This is the thing, isn't it? Because Swiss, it's the cantons, isn't it? I mean, Switzerland is made up of the German-speaking, Italian-speaking. You've got Lugano, whatever. I mean, it's not all the gnomes of Zurich, as the saying goes. And friends have been to Zurich say it's a very sort of almost antiseptic type of place. It's not for a capital city, for a major city. There doesn't seem to be a lot of, and here comes my financial phrase, Duncan, a lot of va-va-voom to it.
Yeah, it's definitely not Wall Street. It's definitely not the city of London. It's, I quite like it, actually. It's quite a peaceful place to go. Good food. It's a nice climate generally. But yeah, I think it is that brand which says, like, you come here and you get nice service and it's nice and quiet and people take care of you. That is the flip side of this secrecy thing, which is, we welcome oligarchs and we welcome autocrats who want to bring their money and deposit it here. But I don't want to put too much. Switzerland's in the name, right? Credit Suisse, but it's not all about that. It definitely happened on the other side of the bank in London and in New York and in Tokyo and elsewhere.
So, what's the culture of the bank then? Is it to be seen as aggressive? Is it taking? I mean, you've got the trading arm, which obviously is well known, as opposed to the sort of the private banking. So, what who was fostering the culture on both sides, if you will? Because they don't just suddenly saying to themselves, quietly across a marble tabletop somewhere in an office in Zurich, you know what, Hans, I think that we should go for go onto the New York Stock Exchange, do you?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think there's people. I mean, I don't know how many people set out to do the wrong thing. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, and how much do they just sort of get there incrementally by stages. I think culture is a really difficult one to pin down, but clearly, there was something culturally wrong there. I think my sort of thesis is that both the Swiss private bank and the American investment bank that made up the two halves of Credit Suisse, neither of them was really at the top of their game. They were both sort of slightly B-team players. And as a result, they were both kind of aggressively pushing into areas where other banks might have said, we're not going to do that bit of business. And the result of that was once you sort of push aggressively on risk, you start to get into trouble. And as I say, if one part of the bank was doing something wrong one year, then the other part was doing it wrong the next year. I think culturally what might happen then is that once you get a reputation for scandals and for risky behavior, you start to attract people who are open to that kind of thing. You start to make people who feel who work there, that actually this is how we go about our business. That if everybody else is doing things that are a bit risky, well, maybe I should too. If everybody else is taking a backhander, which is what happens in at least one scandal, maybe I will as well. The problem then they have is that because of these scandals, and each one of them is a sort of multi-billion-dollar scandal involving things as crazy as ripping off the former Prime Minister of Georgia, or there's one called the Mozambique tuna bond scandal, in which they kind of rip off the people of Mozambique and plunge them into poverty. Every time one of these things happens, you get a new CEO and a new set of executives at the top. And they're sort of dealing with the cleanup of the last CEO. And barely have they dealt with that cleanup, then, their own scandal emerges. They get fired. There's another CEO in. So you never sort of get like a really consistent run of somebody saying, let's do things differently. Let's clean house and be a completely different kind of bank. At the end, you get a real rapid churn. In the last few years at Credit Suisse, it's hard to keep up with how many CEOs and chairmen and CFOs are coming through the door.
But in particular, in the investment banking, we can argue it's because it's the ultimate boys' club, isn't it? I mean, I won't. Everybody goes, look at Wolf of Wall Street, but having sat on the currency markets quite a few times, there is behaviour that is, that it is at the best of times is, shall we say, out there and outlandish. But if you haven't got the constraints on your staff, and if it's coming from the top, then it's almost like a pack mentality, isn't it? They can chivvy each other into more and more outrageous, and I use that word absurdly, behavior.
Yeah, look, I think there's definitely been I'm not the first person to say this, right? But I think in the city and on Wall Street in particular, there has been this culture for a long time of kind of, we work really hard, therefore we deserve kind of crazy rewards. And those are sometimes financial, sometimes there are other things. That exists at Credit Suisse in the same way as it exists in other banks, frankly.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that happens at Credit Suisse, you mentioned the sort of tone at the top. The scandals are not only related to finance, right? So one CEO gets booted out because it turns out he's been spying, his bank has been spying on a whole bunch of former Credit Suisse executives. So he denies his involvement in it, but it's really sort of, a scar, a blemish on his reputation. He gets pushed out for spying. Another one gets pushed out, a chairman gets pushed out because he breached COVID rules and went to Wimbledon, was spotted at Wimbledon when he should have been stuck in a hotel room. When you talk about culture and you see things like that happen, you work in an organization that already is sort of, loose around the edges with risk management and things, and you see the CEO going because he spied on people, or, bankers spied on people, or you see the chairman going because he breached COVID rules, it hardly sets a good example.
So what's the sort of Swiss government's reaction to this about, one of their international, because they are, you think Credit Suisse, you think Switzerland. So, I mean, is there any sort of politicians sort of leaning on going, by the way, can you not be photographed at centre court? Yeah,
so I think it's really interesting for the Swiss government. So in the end, what happens with Credit Suisse is there's sort of, if you can cast your mind back a year and a half, there were sort of worries about the banking sector in general. And so a lot of investors and customers in particular of Credit Suisse started to worry that the bank was in trouble. And it sort of started a bank run, essentially. Yeah. People started pulling billions of dollars out. And there's a view in Switzerland among some of the bankers that if only the Swiss government had stood up and said, we've got Credit Suisse's back, don't worry, leave your money where it is, we've got them covered, then maybe Credit Suisse would have been fine. And because they didn't do that, it was kind of the Swiss government's fault. I would argue, it's not my place to tell Swiss government what to do, but I would argue that what they did was understandable. They looked at Credit Suisse and said, here's a bank that consistently gets into trouble, consistently embarrasses Switzerland. It is time for this bank to go. And when you think of it that way, it would have been absurd to stand up and say, we've got the bank's back. So instead, what they do is they say, actually, we're going to sort of usher Credit Suisse into the hands of its great longtime rival, UBS, at a discount price. Now, what's happened since is there's a lot of questioning about, what should the regulations look like? Should we force the banks to hold back more capital, which is the key tool that regulators usually use to make banks safer? There's been a lot of questions about social media and how does that impact on the bank's stability. I mean, the thing for me is what gets Credit Suisse in the end is this misbehavior by senior leaders and senior executives. And so really what the tool that they need is more ability to punish people for doing things badly. And so if you were able to really clamp down on bad behavior, then maybe you would stop the bank relentlessly doing bad things. And then you would maybe have it clean up its reputation earlier.
And it's not only that; it's the fact that they're doing it with entrusted money. I mean, this might be all very swashbuckling and the whole thing, and let's have a wild and crazy time. And aren't we sort of sailing close to the wind, taking the money off? Because it's the quote unquote glamour of being the bad boys of international finance, but that will come back and bite you on the balance sheet, if nowhere else. And surely it's the fact. When you write something like this, when you go into this, it's all very well to get carried away with that whole, in the same way that people get carried away with Narcos because they think it's glamorous, and Wolf of Wall Street because they think it's glamorous. But at the end of the day, the reality is somewhat different, and these are people's lives that are getting, innocent people's lives that are getting trashed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, look, one of it's hard to pinpoint what exactly is a thing that makes Credit Suisse collapse. There's so many things going wrong. But one of the things I think is really critical, and maybe I'm biased, but it is the Greensill scandal. So I wrote a previous book about Greensill, and this was a supply chain finance company. I won't get into that too much, but a company that was set up in the UK by an Australian financier named Lex Greensill, who was very close to David Cameron. And Greensill essentially invested money in small loans to businesses. And the money, where it got the money from, because Lex Greensill didn't have any money, was Credit Suisse. So Credit Suisse handed over $10 billion of its clients' money. And then when Greensill sort of inevitably blew up, and anyone like myself who'd been following it knew that it was inevitable because the business model simply didn't work. And, people have been highly critical of that business, and Lex Greensill's facing multiple lawsuits. So when that blew up, it was Credit Suisse's clients' money that was missing. It wasn't shareholders' money. It wasn't the bank's money. It was their clients' money. And so I think that's really critical. It happens near the end of Credit Suisse's life. It's critical because once you've lost the faith of your customers as a bank, you're in real trouble. Once the customers say, I can't trust you with my money anymore, well, you're in real trouble because they're going to take their money elsewhere. And some of these people are really wealthy. They have many options. They can go anywhere else. They can move money at the touch of a button. It isn't hard. I think that scandal was kind of, really critical to the failure of Credit Suisse. But it gets the heart of that point you're making, which is that, people get a bit carried away. They're using other people's money. OPM, they talk about other people's money. And that's a recipe for disaster.
When you come to write something like this, I mean, this is obviously something you've been tracking for a while, and obviously your day job, as it were. But are people willing to talk about this now that the dust is relatively settled? I mean, do people want to talk about the collapse?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Credit Suisse, a lot of people have worked with Credit Suisse over the years, so there's a lot of people to talk to. And when the bank collapsed, there was a lot of finger pointing, especially in Zurich. Everybody wanted to blame somebody else. And so as a journalist, that's a great place to find yourself. But everybody wants to blame everybody else. That's kind of, those are the people you want to talk to. Obviously, you kind of check everything and you make sure you're aware of everybody's biases. But that makes it sort of a good place to be fishing for stories.
What are you hoping that people are going to take? Because presumably, people get angry about this because, as I said before, this is people's lives they were mucking around in, and with a sort of fifth form sort of a fifth, a group of oversexed, overpaid, excited schoolboys mucking around with the cash.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason for writing it for me is that, as a financial journalist, and actually I used to work in finance. Some of this stuff becomes, to financial journalists and to bankers, it becomes so sort of mundane, right? You see it all the time. And so part of the reason for writing it was to try and put it in a way that people who don't work in finance can read this book and understand just what is going on. I mean, there are tens of millions, if not billions of dollars just flying around without much care, people ignoring risks. So one of the scandals, they start to do some work with these guys and they get a report done to say, are they the sort of people we should work with? The report comes back and says they're the kickback kings. Don't touch them with a barge pole, and they just ignore it. And guess what? It's a $200 million, $2 billion scandal a couple of years later. And it's that sort of thing. I think ordinary people who don't work in finance have no idea that the sums of money involved are just extraordinary. The amount that these people are getting paid is extraordinary. Some of the CEOs are taking away $100 million pay packets in a single year for essentially managing a bank. They're not putting their own money in and building something. They're running a business that already existed for 170 years and getting paid $100 million at a time when the bank is failing. It's staggering stuff. And I think, for people who don't work in the industry, it's even more staggering, and they ought to be aware of it.
And it's also the fact that we seem to think these people are financial geniuses, and yet the checks and balances of normal life, as you just brilliantly said there, don't seem to apply this. And it is that herd. Okay, well let's take a punt mentality. Would get you absolutely kicked out of any other industry.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, many of them think they are financial geniuses. That's part of the deal when you join those banks, I think. But I think honestly, it's a lot of it is sort of a lot of jargon and a lot of kind of fake it till you make it stuff. Undoubtedly there's some really smart people in banking, right? That's undoubtedly true. But often it goes wrong for really simple reasons, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that things will go wrong.
What are you hoping that people are going to take from Meltdown?
Well, as I say, I think I'm hoping that a lot of people who don't work in finance will get a flavor of just what's been going on in the global financial system for the last few decades in their name. I think hopefully it's a sort of wake-up call a little bit to the people who work in the industry. I think, as I say, sometimes when you're in it, you sort of can't see the wood for the trees. And by putting this all in one sort of long narrative, they can see actually what that bank is up to. And maybe think about what they're up to themselves. The other thing I should say is Credit Suisse is a bit of an outlier in that it was consistently involved in scandals, but it isn't the only one that was involved in scandals. Pretty much every other bank you can think of has had some of this. The Credit Suisse was involved in Nazi gold, so were others. Credit Suisse has breached sanctions on Iran, so have others. They was involved in the subprime mortgage crisis in the US. Wasn't the biggest, others were worse.
Sure.
It had rogue traders, there've been other bigger rogue traders. It goes on and on and on. It is possibly the worst bank of all of them, but they're all at it to some degree.
The book is called Meltdown. It's by Duncan Mavin today. If people want to find you online, where's the easiest place to get hold of you in the nicest possible way?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and if you search my name, you'll find me on Twitter, or my handle is @DUMAV.
The book is called Meltdown. Duncan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.